Grace and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. If it saves just one life, then it is all worth it. You ever heard that phrase before? I remember a number of years ago seeing a practical example of this slogan being played out on live TV. I was a kid when it happened. I would bet that some of you remember this event too. I remember it very vividly because my parents' eyes were glued to the TV. On October 14th, 1987 at 9:30 a.m., an 18-month-old toddler named Jessica McClure fell into a well. Anybody remember that? We don't exactly know how she fell into the well, but there she was, down deep in the well. Immediately, of course, her mother, Sissy McClure, called the police for help. Soon there were police and there were firefighters and there were construction workers and all sorts of other civilians around looking to find a way to help out so that they could get this little baby, this little toddler out of the well. Soon all the major media outlets had cameras coming from above focused on the rescue attempt. Helicopters were flying all around. To clear out the dirt, they brought in a backhoe, but that didn't work. Multiple people started digging by hand. Oil companies loaned them specially designed digging tools to help. Hour after hour went by, live coverage almost entirely, back when there was only 4 channels. 58 hours went by with this baby in the well, and more people showed up using whatever tools they could to get her out. And then finally, after all that hard work, after all the sweat that was dropped, all the dirt, and all the tears, amazingly, they were able to get to Jessica, and she was fine. Like nothing had really ever happened. And I am just certain that in interviews after that event, someone working with it must have said, if all this work saved just one life, it was worth it. Do we believe the same thing when it comes to a person's spiritual life? The way Paul talks in the passage that was read from First Corinthians today, but really he talks like this in all of his letters, as do the rest of the scriptures, it does appear that truly he could say in relation to eternity, if all my labor just saves one soul, it's worth it. But it does take work. It does take sacrifice, as the biography of Paul clearly shows. I mean, how much sacrifice does it take? I mean, we could go on and on with that, but there's a few things in the passage from 1 Corinthians 9 that we are shown Paul does in order to, as he says, win some to the faith. First of all, he says for him it was worth sacrificing his money, or the equivalent of that at that time. In our passage's context, Paul is contrasting himself with other leaders in the church at the time. And as he does this, he notes that he doesn't take a salary for his ministry. Now, if he wanted to, he would have every right to earn a salary from his preaching ministry. That's a biblical idea. It's espoused for us indeed by Paul and by the other apostles, by Jesus himself. But Paul didn't want anything to get in the way of the message he was preaching. He didn't want anybody to say to him, I know you're just doing this for the money, Paul. No, he didn't chide other pastors, other apostles for taking a salary. I mean, the apostle Peter took a salary, we know that. So did the apostle James. But Paul didn't. And so he says in verse 18, I present the gospel free of charge so as not to make the full use of my right in the gospel. Now, do not take away from what I've just said that therefore all of you are supposed to give up your entire salary in order to make sure that this church can properly evangelize this area. That's not going to be possible for most, and indeed, the apostle did have a means of getting income. He was a tent maker. He just worked extra hard in order to get the money he needed for his trips. But what we can take from this is that in some way, Christians, I do believe, are called to sacrifice to some extent for the sake of others, for the sake of the kingdom financially. Indeed, it is because of the financial sacrifice of so many around the world that the organization I serve, 1517, is able to exist. It's all donor supported. Quite literally, we have donors to our mission, including, by the way, this congregation, that send in hundreds of thousands of dollars to us every year for the express purpose of letting us spread the gospel to millions around the world. And thanks be to God, it's happening. But it doesn't happen without the financial sacrifice of others. I wonder if any of you have ever seen the end of the movie Schindler's List before. Whenever I talk about this concept of sacrificing money that some might be saved, I always think about that scene at the end of the movie. By that time, the war is coming to an end, and the 1,100 plus Jews Schindler saved through his hiring of them are now about to say their goodbyes. Now, initially, when Schindler started hiring these people out of the concentration camps to work for him, he really was doing it mainly as a means to get cheap labor. It was not an altruistic event on his behalf. And he made a lot of money. He got rich off their cheap labor. But towards the end, he does begin to have this change of heart, recognizing their deep, deep plight. Because of his saving of them, the rescued people wanted to do something nice for Schindler. So, although they didn't have much, they scraped together every bit of gold they could find. They would take out a tooth that had gold in it, or they would find a piece of old metal that had just a little bit of gold. And eventually they take all this gold and they melt it down, and they make him a ring. And it's a great piece of acting, because when Liam Neeson is handed this ring, his face just subtly cracks. And he begins to whisper these words over and over again. I could have got more. I could have got more. And suddenly he starts going around to all the things that he possesses, and he starts adding up how much the car is worth, and he says, I could have gotten 10 for the car. And he starts to break down because he realizes that to save some is more valuable. In contrast to the regret that Schindler felt at the end of the film, I've also seen the opposite. I've seen people live in the freedom of abundant generosity on behalf of the mission. And I'm telling you, there's very few people I've met in my life that live more freely than those who don't feel owned and completely enslaved to their stuff and their money. There was a man in the congregation I served here in this building in California from 2007 to 2012. He was, he had some struggles. He was mentally challenged, but he was highly functioning enough that he lived on his own, and he held down a job as a pizza delivery driver. He didn't make much money, obviously, but I was astonished at how he handled that money. I remember being at the church multiple nights of the week, and Brother James would stop in his pizza delivery driver uniform. After he got off the shift, he would stop in at the church, he'd take out all the tip money he made, and he would make sure to get 10% of it and hand it in each time he worked. 10% of what he made. And so, of course, eventually I asked James, I said, James, why don't you just wait till Sunday? And he said, brother, I don't want to be tempted to spend it. And so he'd stop by after work and drop it off at the church so that more ministry, more spreading of the gospel might happen. And so yes, it is. We can say, and we're not going to put a number on it. We're not going to say how much, and we're not going to say what you ought to be doing. That's not, I think, a New Testament concept at all. But we can say with Paul, it's worth sacrificing something that some might be saved. Also, he points to the fact that he doesn't just sacrifice financial gain that some might be saved, but he also sacrifices his own preferences and comforts. That's abundantly clear from the passage. And this is a huge principle for us that we need to focus on for a little while here. Let me read Paul's words again to you. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ. Why? That I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. In this passage, the apostle reflects the missionary heart of the Christian faith. And yet it is not merely missionaries that have this heart. In order to win some, Christians are called to adapt, or to use a theological, philosophical sounding word, contextualized. Don't worry, you don't have to have it memorized by the end. But we're called to speak in the vernacular of the people that we engage with, the message of Jesus, to whatever culture we're around. This means that in order to win some, we should be aware of the language our culture speaks and what our culture values. We never change the content of the message about Jesus. It's always the same message. But from time immemorial, it has always been adapted to different cultures and languages and customs. Paul demonstrates this for us in the book of Acts. If you look at most of his sermons, he's preaching to a Jewish audience. And when he preaches to a Jewish audience, well, he tends to preach about the things first that they have in common. They both believe in one God. They both believe that the Old Testament is inspired by God, that the Pentateuch was delivered to Moses. He'll go on down the list of commonalities. And then from there, he will seek to build his case from the scriptures for why Jesus is indeed the fulfilled Messiah. But interestingly enough, when the apostle speaks to non-Jewish audiences, we find a great example of this in Acts chapter 17, where he's speaking to a bunch of Greek philosophy geeks at a place called Mars Hill. Well, there he speaks differently, completely different. He mentions their gods and their poets and their cultural customs. You see, in order to win some, Paul willfully went out of his way to learn about his neighbor, that he might effectively share the gospel with them, that he might get a hearing. And indeed, you still see this kind of thing happening today. If you go back and look at pictures of missionaries connected to our network of congregations from early last century, whether they're going to China or Africa or wherever, they are dressed in the garb of the culture they're ministering to. And they are speaking the language. It is why when a missionary is sent out to a faraway land, it takes a long time to train them. It takes a long time to get them to learn the language and learn the customs. You don't want to accidentally say something that you didn't know was offensive because it's not offensive in your homeland, but it is there. There's lots of little nuances there. But what would it be like if we churches in America took that same posture with our friends and neighbors and co-workers that we interact with on a daily basis? If instead of going out to take what we can get from the world, What if we went out with a posture that was willing to give up our preferences and our comforts for the sake of our neighbors? Because I assure you, here in North America, it is just as much a mission field as anywhere else in the world. I heard a story a while back I just love because I think it expresses how this might look. It was from this Instagram page called Humans of New York, where different people in New York are just interviewed randomly on the street, and they kind of tell their story. And this guy being interviewed this day said, quote, "Both my parents were in prison while I was growing up. I've been in prison for 90% of my life, mainly for drugs. When I got out in 2014, there was this old lawyer in the Bronx who took an interest in me. His name was Ramon Jimenez. He's kind of like a community activist, I guess. I don't know why he cared so much, but he sat down with me and tried to map out my life. When I tried to start selling drugs again, Ramon came out and stood on the corner with me for 3 days straight. Here's this 72-year-old dude shadowing me wherever I go, screaming at anyone who tried to walk up to me saying, 'I'm calling the cops.' I was so mad, but after 3 days, I gave it up." End quote. I don't know how that might look for you in your local context. I don't. I think, though, we're prone to thinking of grand gestures, and I want to let you know it doesn't really have to be that way. It really doesn't. Maybe it's being willing to invite a friend to a church event. Would you be willing to go to an event that they're really into, even if it's not really your thing? I don't know. Would you be willing to sit in a different seat if somebody showed up and was sitting where you normally sit on Sunday? These little things. But it's just little ways of sort of thinking about the other first. Or if you see a stranger that you've never met before, which this congregation is great at, you go out of your way to welcome them kindly. There's all sorts of ways this sort of mentality can manifest itself. You don't have to be the Apostle Paul. You don't have to be a preacher. But you are a vessel that God seeks to use to bless your neighbors. Again, that he might win some. So, we've talked about today sacrifice in order that people might hear the gospel and be saved. But we should ask, what is the motivation for such sacrifice? Well, let me wrap up by again quoting from the Apostle Paul. He tells you, verse 23, "I do it all for the sake of the gospel." That's why I do it. It is for the sake of the gospel. What does that mean? It means that what propelled Paul forward to sacrifice for others was focusing on the sacrifice Jesus made for him. And the same is true for you. It's when you see that because Jesus died for you, that you just might find yourself having compassion to sacrifice your hard-earned money or your comfort for the sake of others. The way you'll ever be able to sacrifice your preferences is by remembering that Christ gave up all the comforts of his heavenly home that you might be one, even though you were not worthy of being one at all. When he came, he was said to have nowhere to lay his head. He did not ride in caravans with great pomp and circumstance, but he rode on a donkey. The crown he wore was not one of gold, but of thorns. As Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 8, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. He endured the shame of the cross, that you might be his treasure, He was spat on, he was beaten, he was whipped, he was mocked, all so that you could be declared forgiven sons and daughters of the Most High God. You see, it's really easy when hearing a message like this from Paul to think about all the ways that maybe you haven't sacrificed enough. Or for that matter, conversely, you might be notching something up on your inventory saying, well, I remember that time I gave and I did this and I think I'm doing okay. But that's not really the point. Primarily, you should hear that in spite of you not sacrificing enough, because none of us ever possibly could, Jesus has sacrificed himself in your place so that you might be transformed into those who would joyfully go out in love and service to your neighbors. Yes, it may be true that we never really sacrifice enough, but we certainly don't have to stay there. As the news of the gospel sinks into us, it can not just propel guys like the Apostle Paul forward, but it can propel us forward so that we might become people that would willfully give ourselves away that some might be saved. Amen.